first thing I'd like to do is actually thank Jesse for delivering my speech, and thank you very much. I'm going to sit down. 10 days ago, I was sitting in a conference, or actually making a similar speech in a conference to infrastructure investors. And the refrain was not dissimilar to the refrain you hear today. Here, we have so much money and we have no projects to invest in. And there's a really interesting dialogue that goes on because nobody can figure out how to make that crossover. The challenge, I believe, is not in financing. I believe the challenge is in funding, and I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between the two. Now, the interesting thing is and I'm going to roast Jesse again because he's so easy to memorize. We jumble up the meaning of two very important words, funding and financing. And in banking terms, funding means financing. And in public policy concerns, funding means funding. And financing sometimes means funding. And so what I'd like to do is just, for the purposes of this, and I hope a little longer than just the duration of my speech, talk about the two. Funding is how you ultimately pay for things. That is either the taxpayer pays or the user pays. And we'll come back to what that means. And financing is how do I get it today? In many cases, the funding occurs over a lifetime or several lifetimes. And that's where we want to get to. One small other sideways observation, listening yesterday and reading about the objections to the new promised gas tax here, I can tell you there's a really promising thing happening in the United States. 2 days ago, they started to leak, and in the US, the way you make public announcements is you leak them for 6 months and then it's an announcement. They started to leak how the Trump administration wants to try and fund its $1 trillion infrastructure budget. And what they're talking about, and this is reported sort of in the two spy newspapers of Capitol Hill, is an increase of 7 cents a gallon in the gas tax. Now, 7 cents a gallon isn't 10 cents a liter and da-da-da-da-da-da, but what it represents is an almost 40% increase in the level of gas tax in the United States. Gas tax in the US was frozen in 1993 and hasn't moved since. That is a massive shift in terms of user pay. And I think it sends a signal, and it'll send a signal to all politicians that it is possible to raise charges as long as you're prepared to provide something to the people that you are charging. The wall of capital is literally a wall of capital. We're talking Jesse's number. I might add a 0 to Jesse's number. There is an almost infinite demand for investment in infrastructure. And when we think about the demand for capital assets, most of the public consensus around investment in infrastructure was formed in the 1950s and 1960s as a result of the end of the Second World War, and people say that's a good thing to do. In the US, they made an investment in the interstate highway system, which fundamentally altered the course of growth in transport in America. I may sound American, I'm actually Canadian, so I can make interesting observations around that. We went to the oil shocks in the early 1970s, and while most gas taxes had actually matched expenditures in transportation assets until that point, most of them were on a percentage of the retail price or the wholesale price of gasoline. Problem was, oil prices spiked. All of a sudden, transportation departments had roughly twice as much money as they'd had before, and the Treasury Department took it. And they said, no, 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 fix it at the level, we'll take the balance, we'll take the overage. And that was really the last time in most countries that meaningful expenditures were made. And we've been sort of crouching along, trying to not offend anybody as we're going through things. And we're just starting to see that tide turn. And we can spend all kinds of money. Our credibility as public servants is not high because we aren't delivering the value that we need to, and we're apologizing when we raise any charges for it. And so I would urge everybody in the room to turn to the new government and say, don't apologize, but make sure you deliver benefits at the same time. So what we've got, 95% of the projects get stuck because of funding. They don't, it's not about financing, it's about funding. does the base business case actually work? And that doesn't matter whether it's a publicly sponsored deal or a privately sponsored deal. You've really got to focus on that micro business case. Rating agencies, and if you read the rating agency commentary on projects and project finance, 90, 95, 98, 99% of the discussion is not about capital structure. It's about the base funding equation that underlies the deal. And when you look at these projects, it's because we don't have the courage to say what we need to say and do what we need to do to make sure the projects are financeable or fundable at the base case. And I think part of this is that we don't look at projects as assets. We look at projects as liabilities. And they're things to be funded and they're obligations we've got to fulfill. Whereas in many cases, we could look at projects like assets. We talk a lot about value capture. And value capture means selling the family silver to fund your current enjoyment. Oh, sorry, no, that was the other speech. It means taking assets that you've got and using them to help fund meaningful and valuable projects that you're trying to do anew. What does that mean, value capture? It could mean value from the users, rates and charges. In the UK, in the 25 years that the water system has been privatized in the UK, the regulatory system and the rates and charges system has generated in the order of £1 billion a year, and in some cases much more than that, going into the water sector, taking what was the world's largest sprinkler system and turning it into a water system. And nobody's noticed. Everybody's accepted the charges. Well, the water rates aren't a big issue. They're not front page news, but you can make front page news out of a bridge across a river. And just think about the scale of that. So that's value from users. And then value from the partner or value created by the development itself. Think about that as a new rail station that creates a node that allows new commercial development to be built. That's also a very, very powerful way. And then what I'll call latent value, which is the value that's associated with an asset that you built potentially years ago, could be a port, could be an airport, could be anything like that, that you want to extract value to use on new projects. And I want to come back to something that Mike Baird said, which was really important. Your credibility and your ability to do this the second time depends on where you spend the money, how frequently or how tightly you tie it to the project. Where the beneficiaries are, where the sales are. I've had half a dozen projects fail because I couldn't get my clients to agree to spend the money in the same region that the asset was being sold in. And that's a really, really important thing. So the use of proceeds, good value, good purpose, and in a very tight location. And it was interesting because the last panel talked a little bit about this. We really need to make sure that it can be tied to the users who are giving up or having their value consumed. Crossrail in the UK is a really good example of a forward-looking approach to value capture. $15 billion project, absolutely needed. London would become an irrelevant rump on Europe if this wasn't produced. You couldn't get from Heathrow to Canary Wharf in any reasonable amount of time. Build this, changes the whole structure of London, keeps London relevant. Where do you find $15 billion in a post-global financial crisis world? It's hard. Well, where did they find the money? They raised business property rates, big charge. They had development charges. They had value gain on land charges. They even got the developer of Canary Wharf to agree to build the station in Canary Wharf, the big station for traffic purposes. They got him to build it. And the number he gave to build the facility was roughly half the number they were carrying in their budget. What he did, and back to thinking of this as an asset as opposed to a liability, he built a shopping mall that had a train station in it, whereas the original plans had a train station with a few shops. And his view of that allowed him to transform this from a liability to an asset. You can get other ways. The city of Portland and the U.S. Northwest is one of those wonderful experimenters, and they have successes and failures. they have gone through and done a bunch of what is called tax increment financing. Now, tax increment financing is financing. The cool part of that deal was they also found a way to sell the development rights, and the sale of the development rights is actually worth about 25% of the capital cost of the project they were trying to implement. So again, thinking of things as assets as opposed to liabilities, very important. I keep looking down here and seeing asset monetization. I want to keep saying that, but please, if you choose to do it, make sure you spend the money wisely for a socially important project and in the area you sell the asset. The worst thing you can do is sell something over here to pay for something over here. It won't work, and it will ultimately either result in the failure of the project or the failure of the government that decides to do it. We've talked a little bit about, I pushed the wrong button, there we go, about user pay and user equity and taxpayer pay and sovereign equity. Really focus, when you look at this, the user pay, identifiable benefits to an identifiable class or group of people. When you want to use the taxpayer pay issue, it's when the whole world's going to benefit, and everybody gets a little teeny tiny benefit. That's very difficult to put a user pay philosophy into place. Even though it might be possible to extract the value, it's very difficult to sustain it through the ups and downs of the project. The other thing in doing this is you really, really have to talk to the public about it. And when the announcement yesterday about gas tax, and you can see the back and forth in the press, and you can see how people are nervous and not nervous about it. You can see it in the United States. Now, the United States probably has argued for 25 years about the Transportation Trust Fund, which is where the gas tax goes. The U.S. Transportation Trust Fund has come within minutes of bankruptcy half a dozen times in the last 10 years. They went through once, they passed a reauthorization, which is how the U.S. Transportation Department gets its money to build things. One year they passed a one-day extension. Like, how can you actually plan around a one-day extension? So, identifiable uses, tie it to a project, you can get there. Diffuse uses, that's when you use the sovereign credit, that's where you use the taxpayer pay approach. Talking to users, we did a job about 18 months ago for the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto has the better part of a third of Canada's population in it, a little bit more of the GDP, and it is geographically constrained. It's got borders around it where they've got other municipalities. People travel from outside the municipality into the City of Toronto, make their money and go home. Horribly underfunded, big contributor of tax. And we went through and identified all the potential ways they could fund their infrastructure investments. And I encourage you to look at it. It's a public document. Just Google Revenue Options Study, City of Toronto, and you can get a look at it. I'm not able to publish it because it was something that was done under a City of Toronto letterhead, so I can't do it, but if you just look it up, it'll show. And interestingly, politics has played a role. In Ontario, or in Canada, there's a three-tier system of government: a city level, a province level, and the national level. And we're heading into an election in the provincial level, and the City of Toronto decided that the best way to do this, to restore some of the equity between people inside the boundary of the city and outside, was to put tolls on two of the big highways. That lasted for about 18 days, and the province, who actually controls access to the highways, said that's great, but no. And we're back at square one. And so politics are going to be part of this. And I would say also that as you're looking at the funding equations, borders matter and borders are bad. And wherever you've got a border, you will see some kind of dislocation or distortion in the economics. And unfortunately, that is a real challenge. When we look at this, there are some really good examples. We heard a reference yesterday to the City of Manchester. And the City of Manchester and its 6 surrounding municipalities getting together and making a program where everybody had to agree on the projects and agree to fund the projects before the individual projects had been selected. So you in County Council 1 had to agree to fund something that might or might not be in your municipality. That has led to a massive transportation transformation in Manchester, a real consensus on how to do it, and proven ability to fund these projects. The financing of the projects has actually been relatively simple post that decision. I've talked a little bit about doing it close to the beneficiaries. And don't worry if they're not 100% solutions. When you look at these things and when you look at the big ones, you look at something like a Crossrail, there are about 10 different approaches to financing that are embedded in there that then have resulted in a bunch of financing options. And if the numbers don't add, please don't send it to the PPP agency saying the numbers don't add, therefore it must add for you. The biggest reason for PPP failures around the world is somebody taking a project that's unfundable and therefore unfinanceable and then saying, ah, yes, but the private sector is stupid and they'll invest. If the numbers don't add for the public sector, they're not going to add for the private sector. And I would really, really point that out. Please don't, you only get one chance to make a first impression with the investors. Please don't give them a bad project. There are countries that think they can do this. Parts of India do this all the time, and they have these failed tenders after failed tenders after failed tenders. And while it makes sense in an Indian context, you see the number of foreign investors decline each time there is a failure. And it's one of the things that they're struggling really, really hard with. Once you get to a financeable deal, then it's pretty easy. And I say it's easy, and that's where I make all my money, is in the second half. But it is remarkably easy to finance a deal that's properly funded. So I knew you were expecting to hear some guy stand up here and say, you know what, thank you very much, or I'm here to talk about financing. I'm sorry I didn't talk at all about financing, but the problem isn't financing. The problem is funding and getting those projects where they make sense. Thank you.